and good evening to everyone. I would like to welcome you to Towards Anarchism first virtual talk. Towards Anarchism is a series of weekly events aiming at exploring and learning how anarchic processes affect inhabited space in its forms, dynamics, and organization. I'm Matteo Fontana, curator of this event, and I would like to thank the Student Senate of University U of Venice for the support in its realization. And we are honored to have Carne Ross as our guest for today's talk with the title Anarchism as a Response to a Complex Society. Introducing him shortly is not that easy. In fact, Carne Ross is founder and senior advisor of Independent Diplomat. During a 15-year diplomatic career for the United Kingdom, he served as a political officer in the British embassies abroad and was head of the Middle East section and deputy head of political section at the UK mission to the United Nations. He worked on a wide range of issues, including global environment and terrorism. At the UN, he negotiated several Security Council resolutions on Iraq weapons inspections, Israel, Palestine, and the 9/11 attacks. He is the author of 2 books, Independent Diplomat, Dispatches from the Unaccountable Elite, and The Leaderless Revolution, How Ordinary People Will Take Power and Change Politics in the 21st Century. He is also the subject of the documentary film The Accidental Anarchist, which portrays his journey towards a new sociopolitical position after leaving the British Foreign Office in 2004. I would like to remind you that you can interact with this live event starting from now, writing your questions and considerations in the comment section or through the form posted below. Welcome, Carne.
Thank you.
I will leave you the stage, and then we will resume together for the Q&A session.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Matteo. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending this talk. I'm going to try and talk about anarchism as a response to a complex society. I'll talk, I think, for probably about half an hour, 20 minutes, half an hour, and then we'll have a time for a discussion. And I particularly look forward to the discussion because this is a difficult, complicated subject, and I need help thinking it through and look forward to the dialectic because it always has things to teach me. I'm going to take 3 approaches to this question of whether anarchism is the right approach for a complex society. One is a systems approach, which is whether anarchism is appropriate for society as a system. Secondly, I'm going to take a utilitarian approach, which is what produces the best outputs from a system. And thirdly, I'm going to take if you like, a moral approach. What is good for a system? What produces good moral outcomes? So let's start with the systems approach. What is appropriate to the nature of the system? And if you'll forgive me, what I'm going to try and do is mix philosophy and systems theory a little bit by talking about the world as a system and then applying a political philosophy to it as an approach to that system. The political philosophy is, of course, anarchism. My claim is that society is a complex system. Now, by complex system, I mean a term of art, a term of science, not just that society is complicated, but it is complex. Complexity. Complexity has specific characteristics. It has multiple actors. In the case of our society, billions of actors in the world at large. They are in a constant dynamic process of action and reaction and then further reaction. It is not a static system. It is not fixed. It is in a state of constant change. And it is impossible to know the state of the system at any one time, because it is impossible to pinpoint billions of actors in space and time at any one moment. And if you did, it would all have changed a moment later, so it you wouldn't be in a position to take decisions about that system. Um, we are habitually used to society being governed top down, almost like an input output machine, that government or authority will make a decision which acts as an input into the machine. The machine or society responds to that input and produces a particular output. This top-down approach, it turns out, is inappropriate for a complex system. Above all, because of the state of information of the system, because as I mentioned, it is impossible to know the state of the system at any one time. Therefore, it's impossible to design a particular input into the system in order to produce a particular output. And yet, government, whether authoritarian or supposedly democratic, relies upon this model that it almost by pulling a lever, whether on the economy or some policy or social initiative, it's able to produce a particular outcome for society, whether economic, political, or social. And I think we can see the evidence from our own societies and our own systems of government that this model isn't working. That governments make claims of what they intend to do, and the results very rarely bear out their claims. Government is often essentially incompetent, and if the outputs of the system reflect the ambitions of the government of the day, then that's almost as much by chance as it is by deliberate action. The problem here is one essentially of information that, as I said, it's impossible to know the state of the system at any one time. Karl Popper, the Austrian philosopher who philosophized the theory of democracy, essentially said that governments could not know the state of society, could not know what people wanted. In a sense, he was agreeing with this proposition that we can't know the state of the system at any one time. But he said that as long as we had an open society with a free justice system, free political parties, free media, and regular elections, then society, through the mechanism of elections and these other elements of the open society, would be able to correct government and keep it on an optimal course and keep it closer to the wishes of the people than it otherwise would be. But my claim is that that is not working, that for various reasons, above all economic, but also because of the nature of the system itself, the wishes of the people and what people actually want and society and what governments are doing and the kind of society that their actions are creating have diverged and continue to diverge. And there is a huge gap between what humans actually want and need from society and what government is able to deliver them. In other words, Karl Popper's theory of democracy is not working, which is troubling because that theory of democracy is one on which Western democracy is premised. What works in a complex system to achieve change is agent-led change, i.e. the actions of individual or groups of agents. Those actions, those agents acting together or individually cannot know the results of what they may or may not do, but they are the only agents who can have an effect on their immediate circumstances. They know those circumstances. They are best informed on how to affect those circumstances. Nobody can know the results of any particular action, but you're more likely to be effective and know the result of your action if it is in proximity to you. This is just common sense. And indeed, it's possible for agent-led change to change the whole system. It's possible in a complex system for one action to trigger reaction across the whole system. A phase shift, as it's called in complexity theory. But that's not necessarily what interests us. What interests us is what is the best way to manage a society. And my claim is that agent-led action is the best way to manage a complex society, based on the primary knowledge of the agent of their own circumstances, that is the best way to manage a system. Because if you manage a system in this way, billions of agents acting together in their own interests, you will create a kind of order. This is the opposite of what the claim of society without government would be. Complex systems have emergent order. They're not rigid. They are not order. They are not disorder. They are something in between. They have a certain stability within the system, particularly when the agents are free to act according to certain criteria. And my suggestion is that a complex system such as society will be best managed by the agents themselves without the interference of top-down authority. Now, this is a rather theoretical claim, I realize, but it is one that actually tries to look at society as it actually is, rather than taking a priori view of what is the best mechanism to govern society. We've inherited top-down government as the best mechanism to govern society for lots of historical reasons, dating back to the formation of the nation state itself, but also the nature of authority that predated the nation state. That system of authority, that system of governance is not necessarily predicated on the nature of the world that it is trying to govern. It is prefigured for a particular outcome, for a particular mode of behavior. It is not necessarily designed for the world as we find it in the 21st century, because of course the world in the 21st century is becoming more complex. More and more actors are interacting together in this state of constant dynamic. And as more and more join the system becomes more complex. As the interactions and the linkages between the different actors, perhaps you could use the term globalization in, whether those linkages are trade, cultural, or simple communications. Those linkages are constantly thickening and multiplying. So the world is becoming more complex, not less. And thus, I think it behooves us to think more deeply about what would be a system of management of that system, what would be a structure of management of that system that would be most appropriate to the nature of that system. But let's turn to utilitarianism now. What would be a system that actually works? Now, my suggestion is that the current system of top-down governance is not working very effectively. We have very clear outcomes from that system of governance which are very far from optimal. We are in a state of crisis in the world today, an environmental crisis where we are heading towards environmental disaster unless society and economies rapidly correct their current ways. But also societies are not just. They are profoundly unequal. Very small numbers of people hold very large amounts of the world's wealth, whether looked at a global scale or a national scale. We live in very unequal societies. I also think that we live in deeply unhappy societies where people are essentially unfulfilled because they are divorced from their essential purpose. Capitalism has forced people to behave in ways which is alien to their true nature, including the nature of work, that people are forced to engage in work which is largely meaningless to them and often dehumanizing. And indeed, Marx would suggest that work itself is dehumanizing because it is making us do something other than what we would wish to do, which is what we would spontaneously as humans wish to do. It's therefore dehumanizing, or it makes us animal, as he claimed. And I think that discrepancy between what humans actually want and need as humans and what they're required to do in order to get by in the modern economy is increasingly clear in all kinds of ways, whether through social ills or through artistic and cultural manifestations of essential alienation from the dominant cultures of capitalism. So my suggestion is that the current system is not working. The outputs indicate this very clearly. Above all, measurable outputs such as inequality and what's happening to the world's environment, but also these immeasurable quantities such as the psychic, um, uh, uh, but also measurements of things like our sense of solidarity, our sense of purpose, our sense of meaning. How can we produce better outputs? Well, Porto Alegre is a city on the coast of Brazil of about 1.5 million people, which was suffering similarly from this sense of poor outputs. It suffers some of the worst inequality in the Latin American continent. The poor, 1/3 of the city's population, lived in deprived slums around the periphery. The rich controlled the city's government. But the mayor decided to introduce participatory decision making, which involved around 50,000 people taking part in debates about how to spend the city's budget, such as water, schools, hospital, housing, and roads. This experiment in direct democracy lasted 10 years, or was studied for 10 years by the World Bank. And the World Bank found that it fostered direct improvements in facilities in Porto Alegre. The number of schools increased fourfold. The distribution of things like water and sanitation, housing and roads was dramatically improved across the city and no longer unevenly distributed between a wealthy centre and a poorer periphery. Moreover, the participatory process was overwhelmingly supported by the city's population. It also reportedly changed the nature of local politics. Everything was transparent, from decision making to the awarding of contracts. And in a sense, regular politics of partisan elites competing for power ended because no longer were they able, once in power, to share out the benefits of power to their cronies and supporters. It ceased being a kind of competition, but instead became a much more transparent, open process of decision making, where contracting was at last public and thus less prone to corruption. This is the radical model that people like me as anarchists propose. Direct democracy, government that is for the people because it is by the people. And if you need a measure of how such a system improves the outputs of governance, then you can turn to Porto Alegre for a very clear example how a shift from so-called representative democracy, where the few are elected to govern the many, to participatory democracy, where the many govern the many, produces better outcomes. It's easy to see the benefits of such an approach compared to the disbenefits and the corruption that we witness in our own so-called democratic societies. So let's turn to the third way of thinking about anarchism as an approach to a complex society, the moral approach, if you like. And I'm wary of using the word moral because everybody feels strongly about morals. But what I'm trying to get at here is a sense of what is a good society, in what is a society where people can flourish best. Now, my suggestion is that all coercion is intrinsically bad, and anarchism at its heart rejects coercion. It rejects all hierarchy. all power of one person over another. Why? Because anarchists believe that this is an intrinsically bad condition for humans to find themselves in, both for the person exerting power and for the person over whom power is exerted. For the latter, it is humiliating and demeaning and obviously disempowering. But for the former, it is also alienating from their essential self. Anarchists believe that humans flourish best in conditions of equality, um, that we are only able to have truly rich relationships. We are only able truly to express ourselves as we wish to live as humans when we live in equality. Um, nobody has power over us and we have power over nobody in turn. Perhaps one little illustration of this is to think of our friends. Our friends are the only relationship we have that we choose where invariably our friends and we are on an equal power footing. Our friends do not have power over us and we do not have power over our friends. And this is why friendships rarely survive employment relationships, because that is the introduction of a power relationship into the friendship. Um, uh, but it is notable that this is the human relationship which is characterized by its lack of a power relationship, and it is amongst the most valuable to us. I'm excluding family relationships because I think families have their own peculiar power dynamics, which we don't have time to discuss now, but in a sense are excluded from the normal way we think about hierarchy and coercion. Um, but anarchists believe, and this is perhaps the fundamental thing that anarchists believe, is that humans cannot live the rich and flourishing life available to them if other people are exerting power over them, or if they are exerting power over other people. We cannot express ourselves artistically, romantically, creatively, in conditions of coercion. And thus, if humans are to flourish as best they might, as to live as well as they might, then it requires an anarchistic approach to organizing society, one where people are living on conditions in a condition of equality with one another. Um, and that is arguably the most powerful and moral reason why we should pursue anarchist organization of modern society, of complexity. Because there's an interesting uh, turn here back to the beginning of the talk, which is that when acting according to our interests within certain moral boundaries and negotiating with each other directly and freely on how to organize ourselves, how we should govern our shared space and live with one another. Anarchists believe that a spontaneous order will emerge, a stability will emerge because it is a stability rooted in the authentic expression of human needs and desires. And that will lead to the emergence of a deeper order, which is very different from the imposed order of government and rules and police and prisons and armies, but one that comes from the spontaneously expressed wishes of the people themselves. And this actually tallies and echoes with a characteristic of complex systems, returning us to the idea of systems theory, which is of emergence, that an emergent quality of complex system can be stability itself. That when you allow agents to interact with one another, an order will eventually emerge. It is not chaos. It is not a war of all against all, as Thomas Hobbes would argue a condition without authority leads to, but it is a spontaneous and deeper order that human society is capable of without authority. And this is, to me, where there is a coherence between these three approaches to how to run a complex society, a systems approach, what is a system of governance most directly related to the nature of the system itself, a utilitarian approach, what actually works to produce the best outcomes, and thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the moral approach of how can humans flourish best within any particular system. And those three approaches lead me to the conclusion, which I hope I have encouraged you at least to ponder, if not necessarily agree with, that anarchism is the best approach for a complex society. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carne. Yes, it was really interesting, and it was really going in depth into the topic of being like in a complex society, also analyzing systematically all of these 3 points. I think that you said really, especially something that was impressed me was what you said about friendships, this powerless relationship that we have in friendship that help us be in dialogue without higher structures, and that I would like to link it with a question that they have about a problem of scale that I see somehow in applying anarchism to a large group of people. I mean, you said that Porto Alegre applied some of this participatory, like this really extensive uh, direct democracy to organize the city. And we are talking about over 1 million people. But I also remember that in your documentary, you were going visiting these small communities, for instance, in Spain, or again, Kurd communities in Kurdistan. Um, so, do you think that as the larger the group gets, the larger the system gets, then the more difficult it is to keep this um, sort of loose framework, this trust situation?
It's a really good question, and it's one that often comes up in considering anarchist systems of self-government. There's no question that the basic unit of self-government has to be small. It has to be a unit where people can know each other and interact directly with one another to make decisions. But Porto Alegre demonstrated that that can be done at quite a large scale in a city of 1.5 million strong. And the example that you mentioned in Kurdistan, in Rojava, in northeast Syria, is also a relatively large area of country. We don't know the exact population of Rojava. There hasn't been a census for a very long time, but it's in the millions. I think a key concept is the concept of confederation, whereby units of government confederate to make decisions that need to be made at scale. Now, most decisions can be made at the smaller level, say the schools or roads or housing or healthcare, but there may need to be decisions that are made at a larger scale. And in those cases, you can imagine a confederal system whereby representatives are appointed at the smaller scale and they represent the wishes of the communal level at this larger scale, at the district or regional level. They are recallable, they are temporary. It's very different from the so-called representative system of democracy that we have, where we elect people to take decisions for us. In a confederal system, the representatives of the local levels could only offer votes or views on decisions that had been already discussed at the lower level, and they could only represent the views of the lower level, the communal level themselves. So decisions are always taken at the local level and administered at the, if necessary, at the broader level. which is the very opposite of the way we have it in our society, where decisions are taken at the top and administered at the bottom. This is an inversion of that system. Now, anarchists don't claim that they're designing utopia. They're just claiming that they're designing a better system. And I think that the evidence from where anarchist systems of government have been put into practice is actually quite compelling, that they have been quite successful, even if those experiments have been, for different reasons, relatively temporary.
I see. But then, for instance, it comes to my mind, do you think that then the will of a person to participate in decision making also at a really small local level to then have an impact on a higher confederative model? Do you think that participation would be higher just because the person would know that their decision it's much more important and it's like really really affecting their environment? Because for instance, I see nowadays also a friend of mine, it's really difficult if there are elections, then the will to go to vote and to express their opinion, it's not that strong, maybe because there is not this strong link between the elected person and the decision that they're making afterwards.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. I mean, I would claim that people will show up to make decisions when those decisions really affect them. That if the future of your local school or hospital is being decided by the forum that you can attend, you're going to show up to that forum because it matters to you how your hospital or school is run, where your kid is going, or where you might end up when you're sick. So I think this is a really powerful argument for political participation. People will show up when a loss is at stake for them. And this is why people are so disillusioned with institutional politics as we have it today, because they feel that their vote doesn't really make any difference. Or if it does, they're only asked to participate once every 5 years. And, you know, huge numbers of decisions are made that affect them, which they feel they have no real say over. And they're right, they don't have any real say over them. You know, all we're doing is electing a small number of people to make those decisions for us. You know, this is not a radical idea. I mean, it's called anarchism. I would call it anarchism, but it's also direct democracy. The ancient Greeks practiced it. You know, citizens would take it in turns to take decisions for the polity. It's not that radical idea. It's just a different way of organizing democracy.
Then speaking really about today's international focus, let's say, we see that like news channels and also our social media feeds are full of this news coming from the Middle East and this difficult relationship between Israel and Palestine, where people from both sides are actually, they seem really willing to have a state, a sense of like this institution that can maybe unite them or maybe protect them from the other, from the conflict, because they seem lost if they're alone. So how do you think this is important in that context? How do you think anarchy, should it come from step by step, coming from this confederative model of government, or and how should this model deal with external models, because still we don't live in a homogeneous world, and somehow an anarchic model may clash with other authoritarian external models, right?
Sure. Well, I mean, that's a really complicated question. I mean, in Israel, Palestine, of course, we're stuck in a discourse of the so-called two-state solution, whereby Israel should be accepted and recognized as a state within particular borders, and there should be a separate state of Palestine in the occupied territories, what are currently the occupied territories. I prefer to look at this as an issue of self-determination above all. For the Palestinian people, the Israeli people have had their right to self-determination in that they have a state. The Palestinian people do not have a state. But increasingly, I'm of the view that that self-determination should take place in the context of one state between the River Jordan and the sea, that there should be shared territory between Israelis and Palestinians, between Jews and Arabs, or in a situation of equal rights for both communities. I think if you take a rights-based approach to the problem, it kind of removes a lot of the confusion and complexities about borders and boundaries and status. For instance, the status of the city of Jerusalem. And that instead you focus on the human rights of the Palestinians and Israelis. And human rights and anarchism is complicated because the discourse of human rights is based on the notion that it is for governments to guarantee human rights and to protect human rights. And of course, where there are governments, that responsibility should be respected. It's absolutely clear. But I don't think that governments have done a very good job of protecting human rights. And by and large, when you look at the global picture, they're not doing a very good job globally in protecting human rights. And I think that human rights flow from equality, from people being treated equally. And that condition of being treated equally only happens when people have an equal role in decision making about their lives. And that only happens in an anarchist model where people are interacting on the basis of total equality without power relations between them. And therefore that system is the best way to guarantee their rights. But it's not through a legalistic government imposed top-down approach, which is the way we tend to think about human rights today. It is instead through a power-based approach where we eradicate all forms of power between individuals and between the state and the individual, between the state and the individual.
Yeah. Then, do you think that there is this like being so close to each other, being so like equal somehow, and also having this shifting from this paradigm of having the state that is protecting the people and it's ensuring security to having the people actually collaborating to being true and safe between each other. Do you think it reflects also on maybe, for instance, I was thinking while you were saying that about both Kurdistan, of course, it's fighting a war nowadays, and so everybody is somehow engaged in a conflict. But as well, if we see Switzerland, for instance, there is a confederation. The Swiss army basically is all the people. No, it's like
Yeah,
everybody. Yes, it's ready to set up with the whole country, with the whole confederation.
yeah,
So it's interesting also to see it in this way, being really
yeah,
connected and really yes available to yes to not uh, be only for yourself, but actually engaging and being compact with the community, with the confederation in that case.
yeah. I mean, it's not for me to specify how a society should design its own structures. All I would say is that those structures need to be genuinely participatory and people need to take part in decisions on equal terms. As long as those conditions are satisfied, then you have a better system that comes out of it. That can be done in many different ways, and confederation is one of them. The Swiss system is closer to it than a very a system of centralized power like we have in Britain, which is supposedly democratic, but where in fact decisions are taken by a tiny number of people. In fact, one person has enormous amounts of power in the British system. So there are different approaches to this. Rojava is another example, which is basically a communally based system where the communal level, the village level, if you like, is the primary unit of decision making, and where there are also regional and district level assemblies where, as I said, people are appointed from the communal level to take part in broader scale decisions when that is necessary.
I'm reading a question that I may put on screen.
I can't see the chat. Shall I? I should.
Yeah,
Here we are. Yes.
Do you believe that in systems with representative democracy, where a majority wins, it is possible to make significant changes in the modalities of government or self-government?
Well, the record has been that these bottom-up systems of government have emerged in wartime. So, for instance, in Syria, as a result of the civil war in Syria and the collapse of the dictatorship in northeast Syria, and in Spain at the time of the Spanish Civil War, I think the systems of democracy are very deeply entrenched in Western democracies in places like Italy and Britain, and it's almost impossible to through electoral methods to change those systems. Electing a party that would introduce participatory democracy is not very plausible, because it's like getting turkeys to vote for Christmas, as we would have it in Britain, or in America, turkeys to vote for Thanksgiving. Why would they do that? The whole political class is premised on a belief in its own right to take power and take decisions for other people. So instead, I think we have to spontaneously set up our own assemblies in the workplace, in schools, in hospitals, which will gather power through and legitimacy through participation. That we set up systems. I mean, there's been some signs of it. For instance, there was a People's Parliament looking at climate change in Britain. I think that if care is taken to ensure that people can participate on an equal footing, and that means also taking account of things like inherited privilege, male privilege or white privilege, which tend to make some voices louder than others. We had to take account of that in designing genuinely equal systems. But if we design such forums and start to operate, then they will gather legitimacy, and we will start to cultural change. And I think that is a plausible method of changing the system.
Yeah, so rather starting from the small scale up, actually, rather than trying to reach the institution and break it apart.
Exactly.
So yes, trying to implement trust and community sharing and participation at a small scale.
I mean, anarchism is not just about political decision making. It's also about a whole way of life, of how you approach life and how you approach society, and that in all your relationships you should reject power relationships. And some anarchists believe that that is much more important than worrying about the form of political decision making. The form of political decision making will follow that cultural shift in society towards a more anarchist society, where people take more responsibility for themselves, where they organize autonomously to deal, for instance, with looking after the vulnerable, mutual aid. This is why we often see anarchist organizations emerging in situations of disaster, where central authority is wiped away by a hurricane, or as in New Orleans, or Hurricane Sandy, as we experienced in New York City when I was living there. That in such situations, central authority is ineffective and in a sense collapses, and in its place emerges spontaneous neighborhood organizations to provide aid to each other, mutual aid. And many anarchists believe that this kind of spontaneous self-organization is much more important as a cultural shifter than thinking about how to change our centralized systems of government. I think both are important.
I'm taking a question. It's in Italian, by the way. So, okay, it's from Andrea. I'll post it in Italian and try to translate it. So which ones the most important steps would be needed to reach a state of anarchy in and in which social aspects do you think it's possible to get it, to reach it? So which are the like really concrete steps to reach the a state of anarchy, and in which,
Right.
especially in which areas of the society they are important and it can be reached easily.
Well, the eradication of authority is the central task. Getting rid of systems of authority where people have power over one another. And arguably, the most important place to do that is in our daily lives. So establishing some form of communal living, for instance, some form of communal working. The workplaces where we spend a great deal of our lives is where we often experience the depredations of hierarchy. If we can introduce equal decision making in these places, the home space and the workplace, then we've gone a long way to changing our lives into an anarchist model, without necessarily having to worry about what's happening in Rome or London. So I would suggest that the easiest and most immediate route to anarchy is and I visited communes where people are learning the practice of living together as equals. It's not easy. It has many benefits, but it also is a struggle. It involves a change of culture. We're all very used to hierarchical models of decision making and having power or not having power. So I think those are probably, in terms of changing your daily life, the most available steps.
Yes, absolutely. While waiting maybe for other questions, I was wondering which, I mean, you wrote few books, and you also write and wrote a lot in your career, but which are your readings on the topic? What do you think is the most significant bibliography to get knowledge on the topic of anarchy?
Well, the central ideas are quite easily available. You can look it up on a website. There's all kinds of archives of anarchist writing available online. There's some good little anthologies. There's a good history of anarchism of the main anarchist thinkers. I mean, they're all relatively recent, with perhaps the exception of Lao Tzu, who wrote the Tao Te Ching, which is arguably the first anarchist text. But there's plenty of good reference works out there about anarchism that I would gladly recommend.
Perfect. I'm checking if there are other questions from the audience. Also, because we have a slight delay in the
Sure.
reach you with the video. That's really interesting, because also I posted on a group of of the European Assembly of Architecture Students, that it's called EASA, is this really important and wide network of architecture students in Europe. Also connected actually with associations in India and South America. And it's really interesting because we kind of experience every year this community gathering and decision making, since and it's a group that it counts every year around 400, 500 people in a single place for a single meeting. And during these meetings, there are self-organized activities, and everything is kept as horizontal as possible, with like building less hierarchies as possible. The only hierarchies are um, just in maybe in knowledge, because older members of the association teach to the younger ones how the system works. And I think it's really yes, it's really interesting, but it's as well something that I notice it takes a lot of energy, you know, the decision making, being like participate in decision making, is extremely time consuming and energy consuming somehow.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is one of the big objections to it, is that collective decision making, listening to people, takes time. But it is, and I think anybody who went through Occupy Wall Street will agree that that's one of the big disadvantages. But there are more efficient ways of doing it. Not every decision has to be taken en masse. You can, as they did in Porto Alegre, they had debates about priorities for the budget. Not necessarily every budget decision needs to be debated en masse. So I'm sure there are ways of, it's not beyond human intelligence to be able to design ways that make it more efficient. But I think there is an inevitability about a process where you're required to listen to other people, which is is more onerous than just leaving it for one person to make that decision. It's kind of inevitable, isn't it?
We have another question from Jaco. At this time, any self-organized group at a certain time must confront a superior authoritarian power. In the case of Porto Alegre, the mayor was the promoter of the participation proposal. What? Wait. I'll have to extend the point. So what approach should the small group seek in order to make its action meaningful and not be subjugated or overcome by an established hierarchical power?
Well, I would say establish anarchy in your own environment. Um, a group of people I know in Queens in New York City established an anarchist commune, and where they share resources, they live as closely as they can to one another, they share resources together, they rented a communal space together for making meals and having social and political events, and they took decisions collectively in an anarchist way. And they were trying to build an autonomous, self-sustaining, independent life. And as I said, I mean, that life was by far the biggest part of their lives. Yes, they still suffered under a hierarchical leadership of the mayor of New York City, the New York state, and of course the federal government of the United States. They had to pay taxes. But in their own immediate vicinity, they were able to establish quite a free and liberal way of life about their own circumstances. We can only control our own circumstances. We can't change the whole country. But I think if we talk about these ideas and demonstrate by example that these ideas are plausible then broader change becomes more possible.
Yeah, I was also thinking, since you kind of identify also hierarchies in work relationships as an obstacle to anarchy, probably. Uh, what do you think about anarchy of the markets?
What
So,
do you mean by that?
um, kind of a laissez-faire situation in which there are no rules governing the markets, and so some claim that actually there is a way of having anarchism and capitalism together, uh, where actually dealing between each other, it's more or less dealing in a market.
Yeah, yeah. I personally think that capitalism and anarchism are incompatible because capitalism leads to such inequalities, and inequality is power. Economic power is power. So I think any system that leads to the accumulation that capitalism does is inherently morally objectionable and unfair. Um, that doesn't mean that anarchists believe in state control of markets. State decides prices or whatever. I mean, free exchange is definitely part of it. Anarchism is above all a liberatory philosophy. It's a belief that people should live freely and be able to exchange and express what they wish, within negotiated boundaries. But those boundaries should be freely negotiated by us, not by anybody else. So free exchange is definitely part of the model. But a laissez-faire approach to markets and let the market decide the distribution of resources, for instance, is not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about anarchism. There may be other anarchists who do. I mean, anarchism is a broad church.
Yeah, I think it's somehow yes, also kind of difficult to have one vision, since everybody is kind of free to decline the topic and the visions of different philosophers and history in their own way somehow. No,
Yeah.
so yeah, there are some main currents of thought, but as well there is not a compact uh, one way to achieve anarchy. Probably also is the intrinsic value of it.
No, but I think I find most credible the people who say that establishing real anarchism in your own circumstances is what you should do, and that is difficult enough. Eradicating hierarchies and systems of power in your own relationships and in your own workplace is 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 challenging. Um, if you're not setting up a commonly owned company where everybody has an equal stake in that company and an equal say in how to run it, a cooperative, in other words, that is, in my view, the ideal form of the company. But it's not necessarily a particularly easy one to follow. It can be very successful. I mean, there are cooperatives that have been hugely successful in Spain and in Britain. It's not an implausible model for the modern economy. And indeed, I would suggest it's a much better model for the modern economy.
Yeah, absolutely. So if there are no other questions, I think we are on on time. We passed the hour, and I would like to thank you very much for your time, Karn, to spend it with us and to give us like yes, a vision of what you believe is the way to achieve anarchy. And yeah, for the audience also, thank all of you for being here. And I would like to remind you that next week, Thursday, May 27th at 6:30 p.m., same time, we'll have another talk, this time with the title Anarchism as a Voluntary Practice with Titus Gebel. So thanks again, Karn, and thanks all of you again for attending. And
Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
thank you. Hopefully, see you in real life.
One day that would be wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.